Yo guys, so it's been a bit since the most recent round of class tuning was pushed, and I've been getting a lot of questions about the updated state of tanks for season 2, so here we are. As always, I tried to be as objective as possible in my rankings here. I've played a lot of PTR keys on all of the tanks at this point in all of the dungeons, so I think I'm in a pretty good spot to give my opinion on things. There are a couple of noteworthy things to talk about real quick before we get into the actual tanks themselves and the rankings, and the first thing is the dungeon pool. Now for tanks, the dungeon pool typically affects us in two ways. One being the type of damage we are taking, and two being the type of damage your group is taking. The first thing seems pretty obvious as to why it's important for us as tanks. Certain tanks deal with certain damage intake better than others, whether that's through access to cooldowns, utility and dispels or immunities, and so on. The reason why the damage the group is taking is important to us is because of two different things. If you're able to help your team consistently live boss encounters or trash through utility or mob control, it's typically extremely valuable. And if the group damage is so high that you're unable to live without healer assistance, it just puts extra unnecessary strain on things, which is rare, but it does happen. So essentially in season 2 right now, there is a large emphasis on healer checks, and the majority of tank busters have been removed, which means what we are looking for right now in the next season is tanks that have good self-sustain, and ideally tanks that can aid your group in some way. Even in season 1, pool size is always typically related to what your group can survive as opposed to what you can survive, and this will be emphasized even more in the new season. So with that said, let's get into it. If you've watched my streams, it's going to be no surprise that I'm putting Vengeance Demon Hunter in S tier here. Although it's bugged, Eldrazi Reaver is looking kind of ridiculous at the moment. Unfortunately, Blizzard removed any and all interaction our new tier set has with Felskard, which just means if you do play this hero talent, the only change from season 1 is going to be slightly more meta uptime. Reaver, on the other hand, now has funnel damage and enables Demon Hunter to do some of the best self-healing in the game. Even after the bugs get fixed, I really wouldn't be surprised to see this tank still thriving. Darkness value has gone up with all of the added healing checks, although it does have kind of a long CD. In a lot of cases, the tank busters were changed to just target random group members instead, which Vengeance Demon Hunter has a lot of AoE stops for, which is really nice. It also provides Chaos Brand, but the value of that is entirely dependent on whatever the meta DPS comp is. Now, Paladin dominated season 1. Their damage, tankiness, utility, and mob control added up to be the best of all of the tanks in every category. In season 2, however, we've been nerfed quite a bit. It's almost reminiscent of season 1 before the buffs in regards to needing healer attention, but you do still have access to all of the utility that makes Paladin absolutely absurd. They are losing the benefits of being able to play Lightsmith, as Templar is so much further ahead on PTR right now, which is more of a hit to be honest. And you're also losing a bit of access to Bubble, which definitely hurts too. But all of that being said, Paladin still has the most overloaded kit in the game, and I wouldn't be surprised if pink was still the go-to as it stands right now. Next up, we have Blood DK. Now, a lot of people have been coming into my chat and asking me about this tank. Shout out to Yoda. So let's get into it. Take this with a pinch of salt because this spec is always God mode on PTR. It's always kind of hard to judge tank performance in an environment where you aren't typically pushing the limits of what's possible in the dungeons. But with that said, in theory, Blood DK is shaping up to be very good in the new season. It's the most self-sufficient tank of all. It has access to AMZ on a short cooldown for all of those juicy healing checks, and Grip has quality of life uses on certain packs where mobs don't like to move. Pull size being limited by the healer also leads us into situations where the tank damage could be lower than usual as we can't pull as much, but I do still think Blood DK suffers from scalability issues. It's hard to determine whether it will actually matter in the grand scheme of things, considering no one is doing anything creative in terms of skips and routing right now, but I do think it's still worth noting. Do I think Blood DK will be the meta tank? Sadly no. Do I think it will be a mid-level key powerhouse as always? Absolutely. Now, I've been saying this for a while, but Bear has the ability to be extremely tanky. However, it does require you to forfeit a large amount of damage in talents, to the point where you're easily the worst tank damage of all, and most importantly, the worst single target. Druid of the Claw is still unplayable at any real dungeon level with how squishy it is, so you really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Their utility is also losing just a little bit of value moving from season 1 to season 2, with the spell having such little applications in the new dungeon pool, but they do have really decent mob control, so there is that. The main thing that concerns me for Bear is the damage profile of the dungeons is scary. There's a handful of bleeds and a lot of magic damage that Bear does still struggle with, and no, the new magic DR talent does nothing noteworthy, which is quite sad for a 2-point node. Warrior has the potential to be sleeper OP in a lot of the dungeons, to be honest. Spell Reflect usage can be absolutely absurd on some of the Trashing bosses, but I doubt it will stay that way given what they did in Season 1. Like Bear, I am concerned with Warrior's ability to handle the bleeds and magic damage that's present throughout a lot of the dungeons, as well as the heal absorbs that are also there. They remain particularly healer reliant even if their damage smoothing does help, which might hurt their performance in Season 2. On a positive note, their damage is actually decent now in both AoE and single target, and their mob control remains as solid as ever with AoE Silence, Shockwave, Fear, and a multiple target Stormbolt from Mountain Fane. I'm leaving Warrior in B tier as it's not quite comparable to the tanks I have in A, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were changes that pushed Warrior up for sure. Then we have everyone's favourite down bad spec. Brewmaster's complexity mixed with their attention seeking from the healer does tend to make this spec quite unfavourable. In Season 2, things are basically the same. The tier set does aid us in providing more defensive uptime, and we can absolutely crank damage as always, but the difference between playing this spec well and playing this spec poorly are worlds apart still. Mix that with the amount of bleeds and magic damage that are present in the dungeon pool, and it cancels out the net gain from the tier set that we've received. We did receive some buffs, but in dungeons, Celestial Brew is just such an underwhelming cooldown that it really makes no difference in the end. They also lack meaningful group utility right now compared to the other tanks I've already listed, which doesn't do them any favours. B tier it is. Sorry friends. Now all that said, I do think there's a lot of potential for movement here, whether it's through player optimizations inside the dungeons or Blizzard's tuning. This is just an update to my last tier list as the people wanted to know. It's not an official tier list for Season 2 just yet, as I'll be making that closer to the patch date when everything is actually settled, but for now, this is my opinion on the state of tanks, so here you go. Here's your updated Season 2 tank tier list.